And today's lecture will certainly tie into the aspects of sacrifice and dying for what you believe in, because we'll be talking about Kamikaze and what's known as Operation Downfall. So with that, let us get started. Yep. Okay, well, so in Japan, the word kamikaze, of course, as we talked about, means kami being gods and kazi being wind, God's wind. We would translate that to divine wind in the United States. And in Japan, that is a reference to Kublai Khan's fleet in 1274 and 1281, I believe, yes. And that was the destruction of his fleet by huge storms, by typhoons, basically. And Japan, of course, had never been conquered. So the term kamikaze would be in reference to Kublai Khan's fleet, not as we would see it probably in the United States. And a piece that I neglected to talk about was in regards to the samurai would be the Bushido Code, the way of the warrior. So the Bushido Code simply means that there's going to be loyalty, obedience, and of course, valuing honor above life. And that honor, as we talked about, can only be regained by ritual suicide or seppuku. And of course, surrender is never an option under the Bushido Code, particularly by this time. So again, that's the way of the warrior from the ancient samurai class. So we have to see the samurai as we would in the West see the knights in armor in Europe. So the samurai are definitely part of a feudal organization. Well, another term that is frequently mispronounced, and I will say harikari, which sounds more like a baseball announcer in Chicago, it would be more properly pronounced harakiri. And I didn't use that term harakiri because I didn't think anybody would know what I was talking about. So if we look at kamikaze, and harakiri is basically a pejorative. The proper term, of course, is seppuku. Kamikaze is similar in a way. During World War II, the Japanese military would never have referred to it as kamikaze. They would have referred to it as toko or tokotai, special attack. The way that we came to kamikaze is that we had translators, many of them being Nisi, first-generation American Japanese citizens. So they were American citizens born here. And they would act as translators, and somehow they got to start calling this whole thing kamikaze. Well, in fact, the Japanese would never have referred to it as that at that time. They would have said primarily toko or special attack tokotai. Well, that brings us to our we've talked about several times, is the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877. And the Satsuma Rebellion was disenfranchised samurai. Remember, the Emperor Meiji had basically ended the feudal reign of Japanese. And so all these samurais no longer had a job. And so they're very unhappy, of course, and they lead a rebellion against the Meiji government led by Saigo Takamori. And Saigo, what he does is, when they're easily defeated, by the way. So the conscription peasant, in effect, army of the Meiji Restoration easily destroys these samurais, the disenfranchised samurais. It's easier to learn how to use a gun than it is to use a sword. It's just that simple. And they also outnumber them by a significant amount. So, but Saigo, when he's defeated, he will commit seppuku. And this sends a message to the Japanese people, certainly, that honor is more important than your life, that he was willing to die rather than to surrender. And another thing this reinforced too, because Emperor Meiji had said that now in Japan, every man is a samurai. And the fact that this conscription army was able to defeat the samurai class at this time is just reinforces that whole thing. So I've talked about Meiji also sending out rescripts, and he sends one out to the military. And it's a very common phrase in the military of Japan at this time to say this: the duty is weightier than a mountain, death is no heavier than a feather. And we've also talked about the concept of kokutai. And kokutai, of course, is the fact that under the Japanese government is really associated with the fact that the emperor is a divine figure, that the Shinto myths of the, what I said, the Kojiki, where they had written that down, that those are actual fact. So the emperor is believed to be a divine being, and Japan is ruled by a divine being, so they have a special place in the world. They have a right. But there's a cost of that duty to your emperor is very, very important, and you're willing to sacrifice yourself for that cause. And then we have the rescript about the education. And so the Pledge of Allegiance, so theirs includes basically this line, that the kids will say they will courageously offer themselves to the state. So even as children, they're told that the ultimate offering to the state is your life. And so what will occur, of course, in Japan is these beliefs will become highly rooted in by the time we get to World War II. So that brings me to the Yasukuni Shrine, which I have a picture of here. And Yasukuni Shrine, we can look at that as being like Arlington National Cemetery, only it has far more religious significance than Arlington National Cemetery. Now, when the United States occupied Japan in 1945, they were actually going to demolish Yasukuni, and we're going to build a dog track on it. Now, Catholic Church has a small but important presence in Japan. One of the key cities was actually Nagasaki, and which was sad in a way. But the fact is that the Catholic Church reached out to the United States military and said, you know, this is probably a bad idea, that this place has a lot of significance to the Japanese people, and it would be best not to bulldoze the Yasukuni Shrine and turn it into a dog track. And so it exists today. Now, the significance of Yasukuni, rather than this Arlington National Cemetery, is this: that if you are enshrined in Yasukuni and you have given your life to preserve the emperor and the Kokutai, then you will become a guardian spirit of the country. So Yasukuni is visited by the emperor twice a year, where he will pay his respects to the people that are enshrined in Yasukuni. And so in effect, by being enshrined in Yasukuni, you are deifying common men. So this is the only place where that is done. So the Japanese people feel that they will become part of these guardian spirits. So that's very, very important to how we're going. So again, we see this, that they are constantly being reminded, they're constantly told from early on in their lives that they are going to be guardian spirits of the country if you give your life. So what this is going to have occur is, by the time that we get to World War II, the Meiji Restoration has created an entire society of people that are willing to sacrifice themselves. And the first picture I should probably mention that there was a picture of Ensign Ogawa. And Ensign Ogawa was wearing a traditional samurai headband called the hachimaki. And he was dressed in a flight suit. And he was smiling for that picture. This is how Ensign Ogawa ended up. Him and another pilot crashed into the USS Bunker Hill, an aircraft carrier, caused 389 dead and 264 wounded. But he did that for a purpose, okay? And I just want to read something here from the book Downfall, and it's regards in a British officer that fought in Burma against the Japanese. His name was John Masters, and he said this: in our armies, any of them, nearly every Japanese would have had a Congressional Medal of Honor or a Victoria Cross. It is the fashion to dismiss their courage as fanaticism. But that only begs the question: they believed in something, and they were willing to die for it, for any smallest detail that would help to achieve it. What else is bravery? So these people were not fanatics. They weren't excited that I'm going to kill myself for the emperor. That's not what they were doing. They had a lot of feelings when you look into kamikaze pilots, for example, that they were willing to do this. They weren't looking forward to doing this, but they were willing to do this because they believed that this is what they should do for their country, that this was their duty. Now, when I was a young guy, young boy, I would always read about these topics, and some of them would be a little bit more lurid than others. And it was common when I was a kid that you would read that kamikaze pilots were drugged, that they were drunk, that they were locked into their cockpits, that they would only have enough fuel for a one-way mission. That's certainly not true. For example, the Japanese military saw these people as an asset. So because they are an asset, they're not to be wasted. So for example, they would have had enough fuel to return. And frequently they did. If they didn't find a target, they would fly back to base and then wait for the next time that they would go out again. So none of that's true. But the reason we're having this conversation today is because what I'm trying to show you in this class is that the Japanese government was going to use this aspect as a way to change the end of the war. And they're going to try to end up, in effect, to try to make a negotiated peace that would be much more palatable to preserving, for example, the Kokutai than you would have seen if they were just straight out defeated. So this was their one last chance to use this in order to change how World War II would end against Japanese. Well, how do we end up there? And if we look at the map, the first thing you'll see here is the green section in that red circle is the Philippine Islands. And the Philippine Islands are critical to the Japanese because if we recapture the Philippine Islands, remember, that's one of the reasons they went into the war in the first place against us, because of the Philippines, is that will cut off their route to the southern resource area. And you can see that crooked arrow there is how their ships would go from Indonesia, Borneo, etc., to get to Japan. So that's where, for example, oil is on Borneo. Of course, there's rubber, tin, all the things they need for a modern war effort. And that all came from the southern resource area. So if we recapture the Philippines, we can now put tactical air power into that Luzon in particularly, and we will be able to cut that route completely. So the Japanese realize that one thing they must do is they have to keep the Philippines. They cannot lose this, and they're going to throw every single thing they have in to protect it. Again, this is well into 1944. So there's been significant losses for the Japanese. So they're going to call this thing Shogo 1, and they're going to use everything they have. Like I said, they're going to throw in their remaining aircraft carriers. They're going to use their entire battle fleet, and they're going to also try a new tactic as well. Now, in a previous class, I had talked about what's known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. And the Marianas Turkey Shoot is simply they were trying to protect Saipan, Tinian, Guam, because that was part of the inner defense zone of the Japanese, and they had developed as much carrier power as they could by 1944 to try to defeat our carriers. And the largest carrier battle in history takes place as what we refer to as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. And the reason it's called the Marianas Turkey Shoot is because the Japanese were so soundly defeated. They lost hundreds of aircraft and scored almost no hits on U.S. ships. The reason simply is by this time, 1944, we have vastly superior carrier fighters. We have radar that's much, much improved. We have combat information centers that will guide our aircraft to shoot those Japanese planes down. And we have the most effective anti-aircraft artillery in the world using what's known as the proximity fuse, which has, again, a little radar in that fuse. So when it gets close to a plane, it explodes rather than having to try to guess where that plane is. So the Japanese are soundly defeated. In fact, basically their entire aircraft carrier fleet loses all its planes. So by the time they're going to do Shogo 1, all they can do really with their aircraft carriers is use them as bait. So they're going to use those as bait to draw our fleet away from Leyte Island in central Philippines. Then they're going to try to sneak their battleships and cruisers, etc., into this area to destroy our landing fleet. Well, that doesn't really work out, to put it bluntly. So, but they're also going to do something else because they realize that they're so ineffective trying to use conventional tactics against our carrier fleet that they're going to do something completely different. They're going to launch the first organized TOCO attacks in history in the Philippines. Now, there's an argument that the Japanese Army had done this first, but for our purposes today, we'll talk about the Japanese Navy and what they did in this regard. So they hardly have any aircraft. So they're going to try to attack the fleet. What they're going to do is they're going to use a small group of Zero fighters, each carrying a 250-kilogram bomb. And it's a small group, really. The first group is only, I believe, 6 aircraft. And they're going to send these guys in trying to destroy our fleet. Well, they got a couple of advantages. First of all, these are pretty good pilots. Second of all, they know exactly where our fleet is. They don't know where our big carriers are, but they know where our escort carriers are, which are providing air support for the landing. So there's a fixed position there. Also, they're able to use the land to reduce our capabilities for radar. So good pilots know where to go exactly, and land base, critical for what's going to happen in the future. And they're very, very successful. They sink, this little group sinks an aircraft carrier, escort carrier, and hits 2 others. So they got 50% hits out of basically 6 aircraft. As the Philippines things go on, the TOCO is pretty darn effective, again, for the reasons I've said. Well, the battleships weren't effective. They had to sail back to Japan in defeat. Most of their aircraft carriers, which had no planes anywhere, are sunk. And the only effective thing they've been able to achieve with the Philippines with Shogo 1 is, in fact, TOCO. And that's still not enough to prevent the loss of the Philippines. So once the Philippines are lost, they realize that they have no chance to win the war. War's ended. As far as winning the war, they can't win. And there's another factor, too, is by this time, Germany is on the ropes. And again, they went into the war expecting that Germany would beat Britain and Russia. So with those 2 pieces out, they know this war is over. So what's left? What's left is a negotiated peace. That's their only real hope at this point. And they now think, because of the success of TOCO in the Philippines, that TOCO is going to be the only way that they could possibly get to a negotiated peace that they'd be willing to accept. So that's how TOCO is going to now become policy. Well, the idea of these attacks actually dates back a little bit earlier, but when we think of kamikaze, we always think of aircraft. And you can see a picture here of one that's just about to hit. And of course, by naming it Divine Wind, that just kind of reinforces the whole idea of that this is going to be about aircraft. But the Japanese have been on the ropes since the end of 42. And some people have started to think, well, maybe what we need to do is we need to come up with some different ways that we can perhaps win this war. And so they're going to actually come up with other types of Toko equipment, weapons. But one thing about the Japanese government at this time is they don't want to really go quite down this road. So they always say, well, what you're going to do, if you're going to make this kind of a weapon, there's got to be some way for the operator to escape. And I would think that certainly by the end of the war, that's not serious at all. And one of the ones that I would like to talk about is what's known as the Oka, or the cherry blossom. The Oka is a glider with solid fuel rocket engines in its tail to get to an extremely high speed in a terminal dive. Once again, our translators have decided to give this thing another name. They do not refer to it as Oka, they refer to it as baka, which is stupid in Japanese. And so we have built this item. So it's a glide bomb. And I would personally feel that this is really the first actual smart bomb created in history. People will argue that there's the Fritz X, for example, which was deployed in 1943 by the Germans. And the Fritz X was a glide bomb. And you would drop it from primarily a Ju-88, and it would have a flare in the tail. And so the operator in the Ju-88 could see it. And then he had what's in effect a joystick, and he's steering this thing into an enemy ship. Pretty smart bomb. The U.S. had a similar idea too. One thing the U.S. did do, though, is we took old B-17s and we loaded them up with explosives. We put television cameras in them and remote control. They were in order to get this thing off the ground, it would have a pilot and a co-pilot. So it would take off, and then the pilot and the co-pilot would get it relatively in the direction it needed to go to hit German submarine pens in France. That's what it was for. And they would bail out. Now, President John F. Kennedy's brother, Joe, was on one of these missions, and his plane blew up before they were able to parachute out. So his brother was killed trying to fly one of those B-17s. And then, of course, they would use the cameras to guide it into the target. But my thinking is really that the really first truly smart bomb is going to be this Oka, because that pilot is going to take that thing all the way in. And again, the Japanese government said, well, perhaps he could bail out. Well, you can't bail out of this thing at 600 miles an hour without an ejector seat. And even with an ejector seat, you're probably not going to survive 600 miles an hour. So that is ridiculous, really. The other issue is, all right, now I've gone to bail out and I'm in the middle of the ocean. Who's gonna rescue me? Okay, nobody. So the whole idea is ludicrous. But so the actual functionality of this weapon is it can get into this. It has a range of 20 miles. It has a 2,600-pound warhead. That's huge. And the warhead is designed to hit battleships and carriers, so it has a delay on it. So it would penetrate deep into the target and then explode. Sometimes Okas were used on lesser targets. In fact, I can't think of any time an Oka actually hit an aircraft carrier or a battleship. But they did hit some destroyers, and it was known that, particularly one example I can think of is the Oka actually went all the way through the destroyer, and then the warhead blew up on the other side. So that's how much delay they had put in. What these were designed to do something completely different. Well, 20-mile range. It has to get to its target using the old, venerable, vulnerable, highly explosive Betty bomber. And by the time we get to 1944, 45, you cannot get a Betty bomber within 20 miles of a U.S. fleet. So that's really its Achilles heel here. But it seems like a really good idea. Okay, it never really works out as quite to the way they'd hoped. Now, got a picture here of Betty actually dropping one of these Okas, and those of you that are familiar with Chuck Yeager and the Bell X-1, he would be lofted with an old B-29, and then they would drop him. And same idea here. So the Betty was designed to carry a torpedo, so it was a pretty simple modification to get the Oka into where that torpedo would have been. So that's kind of how that worked. Well, another key weapon that was developed by two junior officers, starting, I believe, in 1943, so well before the end of the war, was this, and that's the Kaiten. Can be translated as heaven shaker. And that was taking the very famous, excellent long lance torpedo, making it somewhat longer, and fitting a crew compartment inside that torpedo. You can see here in the picture it has a little periscope even. So they would then now have a manned torpedo. The long lance was an excellent weapon as a torpedo, not so much as a manned. It's very, very difficult to control this thing. Plus, it's hard to see. So it does have a range of about 20 miles. But once again, the powers that be and the Imperial Japanese Navy said, well, you have to have an escape route. So they put a small hatch on the bottom of this. And so theoretically, you would get it close to the target, and you would then, right before it crashed into the ship that you were aiming it at, you would bail out through the bottom. Well, again, you're 40 miles an hour going 40 miles an hour underwater. All right. Once again, you're in the middle of the ocean. So again, the thought process that this was going to be some sort of survivable weapon, of course, is just not true. They do make about 400 of these, and about 100 of them go out on operation. Now, that doesn't mean 100 of them were actually used. For example, what they would do is they would put these on top of a deck of a submarine. They would fasten them on. And then they'd use that hatch that was theoretically to bail out. They would use that as an entryway so you could enter this from underwater to protect the submarine. They would then launch by unleashing shackles. So again, they would go out, 100 went out. Most of the time, what would happen is their mother submarine would be sunk long before they got into position to use these, or they would never find a target and they would just go back. One of the two missions that was successful was they attacked Ulithi Atoll's harbor, and one of these Kaitens did manage to hit a U.S. Fuel tanker that was full of aviation gasoline, caused a huge explosion. The only other time I can think of that a Kaiten actually sank a U.S. ship was the USS Underwood, which was a destroyer escort. And right before the Underwood was sunk, the Underwood had radioed that they had spotted a miniature submarine and they were going to ram it. Do not ram a Kaiten. That's a real bad idea. So that is another weapon. Again, only sank 2 ships. Probably not the greatest of ideas. Now, if you want to see a Kaiten, you can actually see one at the USS Bowfin Submarine Museum at Pearl Harbor in Oahu, Hawaii. And so there is a Type 4. That's a bit of a longer version that was made to have a little bit more range. They only made a few of those. But what's interesting with the Bowfin Museum is that kite, and if you look, it has a little window they cut into it. So you can actually, it's plexiglass, and you can look inside and see how cramped that it was to try to use this thing as a submarine. Not very effective. Well, what perhaps would have been more effective is the Kairu, probably mispronounced that. And these were basically realistically miniature submarines. So they were built, they had 2 torpedoes, they had a 1,300-pound warhead for Toko attacks, and they had some range. So on the surface, they could go about 450 miles in range with a regular engine. And then using electric power underwater, they had a range of about 40 miles. So probably a better idea. They were going to build 700 of these. They only managed to build 213 by the end of the war, and they were primarily going to be based around Tokyo Bay. So might have been a better idea than certainly the Kaiten. Certainly went a lot more into building one of those, though. Well, I like this picture. This is a U.S. Serviceman. You can tell by his helmet, and he's taking one of these little motorboats out for a ride. Well, what these actually were is they were explosive motorboats. And they were known as in the Army as the Maruni, or for the Navy, their version was the Shinyo. And so they built 9,000 of these. That's a lot. Now, again, they're not trying to attack U.S. warships with these. They're trying to attack cargo ships, basically, or landing craft. And it was armed with 2 depth charges. They had a lot of them laying around. And they would put that into the front of the hull, and you would crash this thing into a U.S. ship and then detonate the depth charges. Of course, you'd also detonate yourself. Then perhaps I think the strangest were for Kuyu, which were suicide frogmen. And the idea of this was that they would have basically scuba divers. They didn't use scuba tanks. They used a thing called a rebreather. But they would be in the water at an invasion beach. And they'd be in these little bunkers underwater. And they were armed with a pole mine. So they got a pole with an explosive charge on the end of it. And when a U.S. landing craft came up, they were to come up from underneath it and jam this pole charge into it and sink the landing craft. Now, I was not the best of children, I have to say. And when I was a boy, I used to take a thing called a silver salute, which is a large waterproof firecracker. And I would take those and I'd put some weight on it. I'd use some tape or some rubber band, and I'd throw them in the water, hoping to blow up a fish. Now, where I learned that was actually from my father. Because my father, serving in World War II, when they wanted to supplement their rations, they would take a couple of hand grenades and chuck them in the water and hopefully get some free food, which was better than a K ration. So if you think about this guy underwater, and it's on an invasion beach, so guess what? There's a lot of shells going in that water from both sides. I just think the concussion alone would have made this ineffective. So I don't quite grasp the thought process, but this actually was attempted. Then a better idea, and was actually somewhat successful, was Giretsu, which were airborne units, but they're not going to jump out of the plane. What they were going to do is use Betty bombers or cargo planes, whatever they had, and they were going to basically crash land on a U.S. airbase. And then these guys, these commandos, would basically jump out of this plane and begin to shoot up the place and blow up aircraft. And there were actually a couple of times when this actually was done. And it was somewhat successful if they could manage to get the plane all the way to the airbase, which was always a problem. Then another thing is the Japanese military was very much concerned with our ability to use tanks. We had a lot of tanks and a lot better tanks than they did. So they needed a way to destroy our tanks. So what they had come up with was a backpack that consisted of 10 kilograms of high explosive. And what you were to do is you were to sneak up on the tank, you were to jump underneath it, and then detonate this thing. They didn't always have that availability. So occasionally what they would do is they would dig a hole in the road and they would put an aerial bomb in there with a man and a rock. And when the tank rolled over, he was to take the rock and hit the detonator. But again, all these methods were going to be used by the military to prolong this war, to make this war more unpalatable to the U.S. Well, that brings us to the biggest kamikaze action that I'm aware of, and I'm certainly pretty confident, and that was when we began to invade Okinawa. And Okinawa, as you can see, is very close to Japan. And we're going to use that as a base eventually to invade Japan. And the Japanese also know we're going to use that as a base to blockade Japan. And they really can't afford that. So they're going to begin to use these tactics on a mass scale to do something very different. What their goal is they're going to destroy the U.S. fleet. They're going to strand our troops on Okinawa. They let them walk onto Okinawa. There was no opposition of any sort really on the beach. So our troops were then going to be stranded by destruction of the U.S. fleet off Okinawa, and then the Japanese would counterattack and crush us there. And that would be that big victory that they need in order to get a negotiated peace. And so they're going to launch 10 major attacks using Toko, which would be Kukusai. And the first one, 215 Navy planes, 82 Army planes are going to try to use Toko attacks. That's a big expansion over what had been going on in the Philippines. But they're also going to use the flagship of the Japanese fleet, the largest battleship in the world, the Yamato. And the Yamato is going to go with the cruiser Yahagi and also with 8 destroyers. And I would believe the idea, well, it's probably the best to get there, is the idea was that they would fight their way to Okinawa. They would do as much damage as they could to the fleet. Then they were to beach themselves on the shore, use their main artillery to fire at our land troops, and then they were all to get off the ship and join the Japanese army on Okinawa and fight the U.S. Now, that's a pretty unrealistic plan for this little group of ships to try to fight the entire United States Navy to get there. My real suspicion is the idea here was that they did not want their flagship to be sunk in port, or even more to them, more of a disaster would be had they had to finally surrender, that they would have been captured by the U.S. So the goal really here, in my opinion, was that they wanted this thing to go down fighting. It was never going to be sunk in the harbor. And they don't really get within 100 miles of Okinawa before our carrier air power sink everything but 4 destroyers. The 4 destroyers pick up as many survivors as they can, and they actually go back to Japan. So, but these 10 Kikusai are going to be their best effort to destroy our power and destroy our Navy off Okinawa. And the totality of the 10 actually is 940 naval aircraft, 887 Army aircraft. Now, totality, they're going to lose 2,258 aircraft, because there are aircraft that are escorting them in to fight their way into them. There's also going to be 3,067 dead, because some of these planes, like the Betty, have more than one crewman. So they're doing everything they can to defeat us using these tactics. Why don't they get more success? Well, unlike the Philippines, they have to sail hundreds of miles over the ocean. So there's no cover. Many of these pilots are not nearly as well trained. And so they run into the same issues with our that you would see at the Marianas Turkey Shoot, where we have numerous fighter aircraft, we have superior radar, etc. So many of these planes never get close, but they still manage to score 133 hits on our ships, 122 near misses. They sink 36 ships, 218 are damaged. They kill 4,900 of our sailors and 4,824 wounded. There's no doubt in my mind that the most successful tactic the Japanese used in World War II against our Navy was going to be Toko or Kamikaze. I would say they sank 57 ships. There's a debate on that. It was the ship sunk by a kamikaze, or was it sunk because we sank it because it was so badly damaged? Regardless, it sunk. So 57 warships sunk, 400 total damaged. Tremendously costly, but still tremendously effective compared to what we saw at Marianas Turkey Shoot. So what we see, of course, now is the United States Navy, the people on these sailors are looking at this. They're going, these guys are killing themselves. They're so determined to kill me that they're willing to kill themselves. And it starts to cause a lot of what's known as combat fatigue amongst our ships. But it also has another effect. It causes great amount of hatred to the Japanese people because of these tactics. It also has another effect as far as how we are manning our ships. So now the decision is made that we are going to remove most of the dive bomber squadrons and replace those on our carriers with fighter aircraft because we need to stop these Tokos from getting close to our ships. And this brings me to probably one of the most sad events we can talk about, and I will refer to this as 100 million die as one. And this becomes actual policy of the Japanese government. And the idea is this, that they're going to lose Saipan. And it's going to be a psychological blow to the Japanese people because Saipan is the first time we've encountered an area where there's actually an indigenous population of Japanese. So there's no Japanese really living on like places like Tarawa or Guadalcanal. But Saipan, because it had been a Japanese possession since the Treaty of Versailles, actually has 22,000 Japanese civilians on it. And we are going to take these islands because we need these islands because we want to be able to use them for bases to attack Japan with long-range bombers. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, which we will talk about in detail next week. But this is a very sad picture because you see here a Japanese civilian that has jumped off this cliff to commit suicide rather than be captured by the United States. And the Japanese newspapers, when this battle ends on July 19, 1944, they report this, that all members of our forces on Saipan meet heroic death. Remaining civilians appear to share fate. But they don't really know what's happened on Saipan because they've lost radio contact with this island well before this, well before we declare this. Well, 1 month later, in the key Japanese paper in Tokyo, which is the Asahi Shimbun, they write this. And it's a month later. Sublimely, women too commit suicide on rocks in front of rising sun flag. Patriotic essence astounds the world. So what changed? Why did this narrative change so much? And it's because of an article written by Robert Sherrard. And he wrote that on August 7th in Time magazine, where he writes about the nature of the enemy, which describes the events at Marpy Point. And simply this, Sherrod is there. He knows what has occurred here. And what actually occurred is, of that 22,000 Japanese civilians, about 10,000, a little more than 10,000 surrendered to the U.S. and are treated humanely. The bulk are killed in the battle, and about 1,000 will actually jump off Marpy Point and commit suicide.
And they took babies with them.
Yeah, well, I'll get there. Whole families. Whole families are going to do this. And why do they do this? Because they've been so propagandized by their government that they were told that the United States would rape and kill and torture them, that U.S. Marines, I mean, this is unbelievable to me, that U.S. Marines, in order to become a U.S. Marine, you had to kill your grandmother. Now, for a society that greatly respects the elderly, this is horrific. So they portray the Marines as monsters. Not to mention all the other lifelong propaganda, well, I wouldn't even say propaganda, but lifelong commitment to the state, to the emperor that they've also had. So 1,000 people are willing to die rather than be captured. We bring people in that are surrender, and they're begging these people to please don't do this. And yet they do it anyway. And it's a horrific event. And it's so terrible that the descriptions of it from our people that were in the Navy and the soldiers watching this are very, very sad. And the Japanese government is going to change the charade story. So what they're going to do is they're going to try to convince their people that they should indeed fight to the death, and convince the United States that they will never surrender. Again, they're looking for that negotiated peace. And so Sherrod actually wrote this in the article. Do the suicides on Saipan mean the whole Japanese race will choose death before surrender? Perhaps that is what the Japanese and their strange propagandists would like us to believe. Of course, he knows 10,000 have surrendered, are in custody. The Japanese, though, have told their people that's not what happened, that everybody is dead. And so what the Japanese are trying to do here is they're trying to get us to ask, will they fight to the death? But they're also trying to get their own people to believe that they will fight to the death and prevent that unconditional surrender. It goes so far as the emperor wishes to send a statement out to Saipan. He does not actually send this out. But what he wants to do is he wants to commit to the people that have died on Saipan that if they would fight to the death, that they would indeed become guardian spirits of the nation. So even the emperor is getting involved in offering them this idea of an enhanced afterlife. Well, this is a picture I believe my wife took on Marpy Point in 2019. And if you look at the people on the top left corner of that picture, you can see that if you jump off that cliff, you're certainly not going to survive. And there are numerous monuments that have been built by the Japanese people to commemorate this event. Certainly, it's an incredibly sad place. And if you should ever go there, I think you should treat it with the respect that it deserves, because it's a terrible, terrible idea what occurred at that place. Well, that brings us to Operation Downfall, which is our plan to invade Japan proper, the main islands of Japan. And we were going to do this with the British actually asked if they could help us with this. They were willing to contribute 6 divisions. We told them no, that this would cause too much of a logistics problem because they use different rifles, they use different ammunition, etc. So, but they did contribute a group of aircraft carriers and some battleships to help blockade Japan. But we are basically going to do this on our own. Well, how do we get to this point? And we get to this point from the Casablanca Conference of January 1943. That's between basically FDR and Churchill and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You can see all these military guys behind them. And what they're going to do is they're going to come out. How are they going to pursue the war going forward in January of 43? And the story goes that it just popped into FDR's head that he was going to demand unconditional surrender. Well, that's not what occurred. I mean, it was actually planned that they were going to do unconditional surrender. And the reason they're going to do unconditional surrender is simply that they want to prevent what occurred in World War after World War I, which was the German myth of being the German army was stabbed in the back. They were stabbed in the back by Jews and communists at home, that they were never defeated in the field. And the decision is made at this conference that what they're going to do is they're going to demand unconditional surrender simply so they can, that will never be a narrative. Their militaries will be completely defeated. And most importantly, what they will do is they will impose democratic governments on these warring powers, on the Axis. And they really believe that by having a democratic government, that will prevent future wars, that democracies are much less likely than fascist or fascistoid governments are to try to go to war. And if we think about Germany and Japan today being democracies, they certainly are no threat of going to war with us anytime soon, I would assume. So I would agree with their idea that they needed to get democratic governments into these countries. Well, of course, this gives the Germans and the Japanese a great propaganda mode. See, the U.S. isn't going to, they're going to defeat us completely, and they're going to enslave us, or they're going to, rape and kill and do all these bad things to the Japanese. And about 2 weeks after he gets back from the conference, FDR has to clarify the statement, and he says this: "We mean no harm to the common people of the Axis nations, but we do mean to impose punishment and retribution upon their guilty and barbaric leaders." So he's going to separate the population of these countries from their governments. And again, they want to impose new governments upon them. Well, then a little later, they're going to have a conference at Quebec, and again, it's going to be FDR and Roosevelt. You can also see the Prime Minister of Canada there. And what they decide is they need to come up with an idea of how the war is going to really end. They start to believe that it may not be till 1947 or 1948 that they can actually even defeat Japan. And that starts to become a problem, because they feel that the United States people and the British people will not tolerate the war going on that long. And so at the Quebec conference, what they decide is they need to end the war much quicker. And the decision is made that what they will do is that 1 year after Germany is defeated, that Japan will be defeated as well. Well, how are you going to do that? Well, the Navy's idea was that there would be a blockade. Again, that's War Plan Orange, which we've talked about. They'd march across the Pacific. They would always stay within range of tactical air power, and then they would blockade Japan. There would never be an invasion, and Japan would then surrender because they've been blockaded. Well, that's decided that that's too slow. So now the idea is that we're going to need to, because of morale, we're going to need to invade the Japanese home islands, because the one thing they want to prevent is the war going on and on and on. There's 2 million Japanese that are not in Japan. They're in China, they're in Indochina, they're in Indonesia, etc. And they don't want to have to fight all these people. So they need a way for the Japanese government to be destroyed as quickly as possible. And that's going to be by an invasion. Navy not too fired up about this, but they do agree. And so what we have to think about now is this question: is the morale of the British and the United States people more important than the amount of casualties that are going to occur by invading Japan proper. And we need to think about trying to invade Japan. Japan is a mountainous country. It doesn't have a lot of good beaches that are suitable for an invasion. It has at this time, almost no roads that are worth anything. Most transportation with Japan is on shipping through the inland sea or using railroads. So it's not really a place that's well designed for us to be able to use our typical European style military where we have a lot of tanks and trucks, etc. It's not going to be easy. And the Navy still wants to invade China, which is not going to happen because, quite honestly, the Chinese Army by this time is virtually powerless because they've had such a huge amount of losses by the last Japanese offensive in World War II, which is actually in China, the largest Japanese offensive. And so even though China's not out of the war, their military has become relatively ineffective. So we're not going to land on China without help from the Chinese, and that's not going to happen. So that part of War Plan Orange is out the window. So they're going to have to use everything from Okinawa. And always we look at the idea that we need to be within tactical range. So we need tactical air power in order to achieve our goals militarily. Well, Okinawa is close enough to Kyushu, which is the southernmost main Japanese island. So it's only 350 miles. So if we look at this map, you'll see how this is going to be a two-phase operation. Okinawa is the lower black circle. Kyushu is the red circle above that. And then the key item is going to be the Kanto Plain, which is where Tokyo is. And that is the further up circle where that would occur. That's where most of the population of Japan are living. That's where the emperor is. That's where the government is. That's the main goal. So they're going to have a plan called Operation Olympic. That's the first part of this. And Operation Olympic is simply that they're going to invade Kyushu in order to use that for air bases. And it's a big operation. They're going to they're going to land about 770,000 U.S. troops in order to achieve this. That's a lot of people. That's way more than D-Day, for example. So it's going to be 9 divisions originally, but then it's going to grow to 11 total divisions for this. Normandy, of course, initially was 7. So big concentration of forces here. There's another problem going on with this whole idea is that we are no longer in a two-front war. And since we're no longer in a two-front war, the American people are basically demanding that we begin demobilization. And so the decision is made is we will demobilize 1 million troops. Well, how do you do that fairly? It's not easy. You can't, if you take a whole unit, what about people that have been fighting for a long time? So the decision is made, and it's a terrible decision, actually, is what they're going to do is create a point system. And you will get so many points. How many years or how many months of service have you had? How many months of service had you had overseas? Have you been in battles? Have you won a medal? Do you have a wife and children? All these things will equal to points. When you get to enough points, you will be discharged. Well, problem with that is you have the thing called unit cohesion. So when you start plucking people out by points, you basically that whole structure begins to collapse. So for one of the most extreme examples is an artillery unit in Europe that's been fighting for a long time. And every officer except the commanding officer is discharged. That unit doesn't have much cohesion after that point. So our whole idea is okay, well, how are we going to get this to work? Well, maybe what we'll do is we'll take these people back to the United States, these units that are messed up, and we'll retrain them and then send them off to Japan. Well, the problem is that some of these units are needed by November 1st. The war in Germany hasn't ended till May. So there's not enough time to get them from Europe to the United States to retrain them and then send them off to attack Japan. This isn't going to work. So my thinking is seriously because of all this chaos that we put into our military, that this would not have been a particularly effective invasion. It would have certainly had some major issues with it, with the units. So, and that's only the first phase of what's known as Operation Downfall. The second phase is going to be Operation Coronet, which is much larger. That is going to be the invasion of the Kanto Plain and to capture Tokyo. That invasion is going to include 1.2 million men, 20 infantry divisions, 3 marine divisions, 2 armored divisions, and plus all the naval and all the Army Air Force that you're going to need to launch that giant invasion. That is a huge invasion. But that was going to take place March 1st of 1946. And again, the whole goal here is to end that war as quickly as possible. Well, the Japanese have another idea. Because quite honestly, they're not stupid. They know where Okinawa is. They know how we operate. We've been fighting us for years. And they see that the logical place for us to assault the home islands is going to be Kyushu. Now, the initial assumption for the U.S. was that there would only be 3 divisions in the south, Japanese divisions, and 3 Japanese divisions in the north, and about 2,500 aircraft total. That's what our assumptions were. And that is going to be a major problem for us because, quite honestly, that's probably not how it's going to work out. And if you see the map there, they were never going to capture the entire island. They were going to just capture to that red line. They were going to, that's known as the stop line. So that was our plan. Okay. And then they thought, well, it's going to take us 90 to 120 days to do this. And our expected casualties for that are going to be about 23,000 in the first 30 days. Total casualties are going to be 105,000. Well, these numbers are not very accurate, as we'll see, because the Japanese response to Ketsugo is going to be a tremendous amount of buildup. So again, they know what our ideas are. They know most likely we're going to go for Kyushu, and they're going to make this so costly that this will hopefully be a reason why the U.S. population will say after this battle that we won't continue, that we will then agree to a negotiated peace because it's going to be such a terrible battle. And they're going to use everything they can because, again, their fear is that we will not invade. I know that might sound strange, but again, their goal is to make this thing terrible. So they are more afraid that we will not invade, that instead what we will do is blockade. And they feel that if a blockade goes on for a long enough time, the Japanese people will begin to overthrow the Kokutai, simply. They are also afraid that perhaps communism will become in effect. And the last thing they want is communism, of course, because they view communism as equivalent to regicide. So the Japanese military and the Japanese government leaders are actually more afraid that we will not attack because they're so concerned about protecting the national polity. Well, Okinawa will fall on June 22nd, but on June 9th, the emperor's closest advisor, his name is Koichi Kido. Koichi Kido reaches out to the emperor and says, perhaps I have a plan here that might be agreeable and to the Japanese government and to the Japanese people. And what he thinks is they're going to do this, is they're going to offer to withdraw from all occupied territories. So that would be North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Malaya, Indochina, etc. Or excuse me, Dutch East Indies, Indonesia. And we will agree that we will withdraw as soon as the Allies agree that all of these will become independent countries. So they will basically give up colonialism in all of Asia. And then we will, once they agree to that and they set up independent countries, then we will withdraw all our troops. Of course, that's going to make Japan appear to be the father of Asian nations, which they've been trying to get to for a long time. Of course, it's going to make Japan be the leader of Asia. And of course, we're never going to agree to that. Certainly the British aren't going to agree to that. And then he also says, well, the other thing we're going to do is we're not going to, we'll disarm a little, but there's certainly not going to be any occupation of Japan. And also, of course, there's going to be no change whatsoever in the Japanese government and the Kokutai. Well, the emperor says, you know, I think that's a pretty good plan. Like that one. And he goes, you know, but in order for the Allies to do this, we must have one more victory, and that victory is going to be hopefully Ketsugo. Of course, the U.S. and Britain would never, ever have agreed to this. But so they're going to build up their forces. So remember, it was 3 divisions in the north, 3 divisions in the south. They're going to take that up to 14 divisions. And they get this done really fast, way faster than we thought. They're going to use every kind of kamikaze they can use. They're going to not have 2,500 planes, but they're going to actually have a total of 10,000. Now, how do they get to that number? Is they're going to use all their trainers. There's no use for trainers anymore. So they're going to use all their trainers. So the actual totals is about 5,600 aircraft would be used for Toko. So that's a huge change. Operations are going to differ completely because, again, it's going to be much, much more like the Philippines. They can use the ground as cover, so they can't be, use the radar flying hundreds of miles over the ocean. It's going to be like the Philippines again, because they're going to know exactly where our ships are, because they're not going after warships this time. They're going after our cargo ships and our troop transports. They're trying to make this as bloody as they can possibly make it. And it's a lot easier to sink a cargo ship than it is to sink a warship. They're not built the same. They certainly don't have as much armament. And that's going to, so there's 2 issues there. The big blue blanket, that screen of U.S. aircraft that we have developed, that's not going to be used because, again, they're coming in over land. It's going to be much, much easier for them to get hits because, again, these ships are in one location. Again, one big caveat is these pilots are not as good as the pilots that were used in the Philippines, but I think that's going to be offset just by sheer numbers and by the fact that they've switched what kind of targets they're going after. Well, the Japanese Navy, again, is going to use all of its Toko equipment. Everything they have is going to go into this. The Army has a different plan as well. Early in the war, they would defend on the beaches. And then when we look at battles like Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Peleliu, what they had done then is they would let us get onshore, but then they would defend out of fixed positions, caves, bunkers, etc. And that was to offset our artillery capabilities and our tanks, of course. So they're going to do that. So now what they're going to do is they're going to have about 3 miles back, so they can't get destroyed on the beach by our naval firepower. And then they're going to run into these first static divisions. Then they're going to have counterattack divisions stacked in behind them. So it's a complete different concept from what they've been using. The goal, of course, is that we've taken so many casualties from the Toko that this will be effective. Questionable, but certainly a possibility. But then perhaps most disturbing of all is they're going to do something called mobilizing the Patriotic Citizens Corps. And what this is they're going to take all men that are 15 to 60 years old, all women 17 years old to 40. They don't have uniforms. They don't have regular weapons, but they are expected to fight. This is going to come to about 1.2 million to 2 million total available people to fight the U.S. military on Kyushu. Now, when we think about this, I'm a US soldier or Marine, and I'm walking through a Japanese village. And I pass a group of teenage girls. And we get past them, and all of a sudden, one of those teenage girls cuts up and stabs my best friend in the back with a pitchfork. How am I going to treat Japanese civilians going forward? I'm not going to trust them because the Japanese government has turned their civilians into military. It's going to be 100 million die as one. And even the US 5th Air Force makes the declaration that there are no civilians in Japan. So this is just going to turn into a bloodbath. Japan goes so far as to close many schools, particularly the older grades. I believe 5th or 6th grade onward, the equivalent. They close those schools so the children can then take part in the war and, of course, their teachers. So it's a terrible usage of this would ever occur of how the Japanese people would have suffered and the amount of casualties that this is going to generate for them as a society. But it's a society they had actually created. And what happens is we have tremendous ability to read Japanese codes. And the numbers are literally staggering. We literally have thousands of people dedicated to reading codes. It gets to the point by this time that we are reading 1 million Japanese Army codes alone a month. Communications. So 1 million communications a month are being read by us. We have a very good idea what's going on in Japan. We can read a lot of their Navy codes, not as much as the Army, and we can, of course, read all their diplomatic codes, which will certainly become important when we get to our last class. But we have this capability, and we know now that our best estimate is that they are going to have 550,000 men on this island. The fact is, by the time August would roll around, they have 900,000 men on this thing. Remember, our invasion is taking in November 1st. And the U.S. Army still wants to invade. So they start looking around at different places. Maybe they can land, and I've got it circled there, in the Japanese island of Shikoku. Perhaps they can land on the western shore of Honshu. And none of these are within tactical air range. So the whole idea of this is going to be pretty much out the window. They cannot use, for example, Iwo Jima as a staging base for aircraft because Iwo Jima is so tiny. It's only 4.2 square miles. So you can't put a giant air base on Iwo Jima. And what has happened now is we always want to attack with a 3-to-1 advantage. So if we're going to have a 3-to-1 advantage, initially we saw 770,000 troops against 3 Japanese divisions, total 350, even after they bring in extras. So that was well over a 3-to-1 advantage. Now we're actually looking at, we're going to invade and they're going to be actually outnumbered. So that's a huge problem. That's not a good plan for an invasion. And of course, the Japanese are going to put tanks, and I threw this one in. I just thought it was kind of interesting. This is the best Japanese tank made in the war. It was the Type 3 Chuni. It's perhaps a little bit better than a Sherman, but roughly equivalent to a Sherman. The Japanese total build on this tank, their best tank, was 60 tanks. Of course, we built over 40,000 Shermans. So it's not going to be a huge factor, but I just think that the Japanese were so concerned with our tanks that they tried to finally build something that was equivalent. And when we look at casualty figures for Okinawa, we had an 82-day fight on Okinawa. There were 75,000 Japanese troops, and there were 25,000 conscripted Okinawans, which were somewhat trained and somewhat armed. And we suffered 72,000 casualties to take Okinawa in 82 days, 12,510 dead. So what would our casualties have been in 120 days versus 900,000 Japanese? It certainly would have been a lot higher than the estimate originally of 23,000 and 105,000 total. And so the Army starts looking at this, and MacArthur, who's in charge of this whole thing, his intelligence main guy is Willoughby, and Willoughby starts looking at the numbers and says, I think probably we're looking more like about 280,000 casualties instead of 105. And maybe across all units, everything, the Navy, et cetera, we could get as high as 500,000. That's a lot of casualties. Of course, how high would the Japanese casualties have been? There's no way to really estimate. The lowest estimate I've ever seen is 585,000. So this would have been a disaster on both sides for many reasons. And historians have looked at these casualties post-war and said, because post-war, Truman has said that we saved 1 million casualties by using the atomic bomb. And historians, revisionist historians particularly, will look at these numbers and say, well, your original number was only 23,000 and 105,000. So how do you get to 1 million? And that's just an excuse for why you use the atomic bomb on the Japanese people. And I would say that when you really analyze this entire situation, you realize that that initial number was incredibly low. So it kind of throws that revisionist argument out the window. Well, it gets to the point where later on we begin to think, perhaps the U.S. Army thinks, maybe we can use a couple of those Fat Man bombs and use them as a tactical weapon. And of course, the idea then is that they will march in 48 hours after we've dropped bombs on Japanese fixed positions. Well, again, they don't know a lot about radiation issues. I think 48 hours would have been a little bit too quick to go marching in there myself. I know I wouldn't do that. But again, they didn't really have a good handle on radiation, I don't believe, at this time. So the invasion prospects have gotten so terrible that the U.S. Navy, which was never excited about this whole idea, they begin to back off. And there's actually documentation that shows that Nimitz was writing letters to King. King is the head of the U.S. Navy, and that this is not looking like a good idea. And they have never actually committed to the second part, which was the invasion of the Kanto Plain. So there's a good possibility that the United States Navy would have withdrawn support of this, even though the Army, as late as August 15th, right before the Japanese surrender, were still planning on to invade Kyushu. But my thinking is this, is Truman was very, very concerned about casualties. Very concerned. Truman had fought in World War I as an artillery officer. He knew a little bit about what was going on in a war. And I don't think that Truman ever would have accepted the kind of casualties that would have taken place invading Japan proper. So I would say that it is incredibly doubtful that we would have ever invaded Japan. But certainly the alternative of blockade would have taken much, much longer. And of course, that would have caused different casualties, as we will see when we get to our last presentation 2 weeks from now. So thank you all for coming, and hopefully we'll see you all next week.